Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Ever wish there was like a super simple way to kind of boost your health without having to like totally change what you eat? I know I do.
Yeah, well, we all want the magic bullet, right? But seriously, though, today we're going to dig into some pretty interesting science about how what you eat and when you eat it can affect your workouts.
Right. We're going to be focusing on the timing of those meals, not just what's on your plate. It's all about how diet and exercise work together. And for this deep dive, we've got some fascinating research to unpack.
Yeah, we've got this really cool scientific review that looked at tons of studies, like a huge analysis. And we'll also touch on some recent articles about intermittent fasting, because everyone's talking about it.
Exactly. And for our listeners who are always looking for the most effective and efficient ways to learn about all this health and fitness stuff without getting totally overwhelmed, that's what we're all about today.
Yeah, no information overload here. We just want to pull out the most important stuff from this research and help you guys figure out what it all means for your own health journey.
Okay, so let's jump right into it. This scientific review, this analysis, what's the deal with that?
So this analysis was published back in September 2024, and it was seriously comprehensive. They looked at 78 randomized controlled trials, RCTs, those studies where people are randomly put into different groups to test something out.
Right, got it.
So they had over 5,000 healthy adults in these studies. Ages range from 18 to 65. That's a lot of data to work with, which makes this analysis pretty powerful.
For sure. So what were the researchers actually trying to find out with all of this data?
Well, they wanted to see how different combos of exercise and popular diets affect what your body's actually made of. Stuff like weight, body mass index, body fat percentage, and lean body mass, like how much muscle you have.
Gotcha. So it's about figuring out what actually works for changing your body composition, right?
Exactly. They wanted to see which strategies were most effective for different fitness goals.
Okay, so what specific diets were they looking at in this analysis?
Okay, so they focused on 4 popular approaches. First up, calorie restriction, which is basically just eating fewer calories overall. Then there's 5-2, intermittent fasting, where you eat normally for 5 days and then restrict calories for 2.
Yeah, I've heard about that one.
Yeah, that's pretty popular. Then we have time-restricted eating, where you eat all your meals within a specific window of time each day.
So like only eating between certain hours.
Yep. And last but not least, the ketogenic diet, which is super low in carbs and high in fat.
Oh yeah, keto, that's everywhere these days.
It's definitely trendy.
So those are the diets. What about the exercise side of things?
They covered a good range: aerobic exercise like running or cycling, resistance training, which is your weightlifting, and even programs that combine both types.
Okay, so we've got all these different diets, all these different exercises. How do they actually compare them all? It sounds really complicated.
Well, it was pretty involved. They did a really thorough search of all the major scientific databases up to May 2024, looking for high-quality studies that fit their criteria.
What kind of criteria?
They had to be RTTs with healthy adults, and they had to include both an exercise component and one of those dietary approaches. Plus, they had to actually measure changes in body composition.
So they were pretty strict about the studies they included.
Definitely. And to make sense of it all, they used this really cool statistical method called network meta-analysis. Basically, it lets them compare the effectiveness of all those combinations indirectly, even if they weren't directly compared in the same study.
Wow, that sounds pretty high level. I'm guessing most people haven't heard of that.
Probably not, but it's super useful for this kind of research. And to rank the interventions, they use something called surface under the cumulative ranking curves. It's a mouthful, I know, but you can think of it like each combination gets a score based on how well it performed across all those studies. It's called SUCRA. So the higher the SUCRA score, the more likely it is that the combination is the most effective.
Okay, that actually makes sense. So after all that, what were the major takeaways? What did they find out?
Okay, let's break it down by what they measured. For losing weight and reducing BMI, body mass index, plain old calorie restriction plus exercise was the clear winner. Then it was the ketogenic diet with exercise, then time-restricted eating with exercise, and last was 5-2 intermittent fasting with exercise.
So calorie restriction and exercise is the best combo if you want to lose weight and lower your BMI.
Yep. And just to give you a sense of the differences, the 5-2 intermittent fasting with exercise group, they had a smaller effect on weight loss and BMI compared to the calorie restriction group. And time-restricted eating with exercise also had a smaller effect on weight loss. but the impact on BMI was pretty close to calorie restriction.
Interesting. So there are definitely differences between the groups, even if they all involve some kind of calorie control.
Oh yeah, for sure. And the keto diet with exercise, well, that was less effective than calorie restriction for both weight loss and BMI, but it still ranked pretty high overall.
Gotcha. So if shedding pounds is your main goal, reducing calories and hitting the gym seems like the best bet based on this analysis.
It does, yeah.
Makes sense. Now, what about losing body fat specifically? Did the rankings change for that?
Not a ton. Calorie restriction with exercise was still #1 for reducing body fat percentage. But the other rankings did shuffle a little bit. 5-2, intermittent fasting with exercise came in second, then time-restricted eating with exercise, and last was the ketogenic diet with exercise.
So keto was the least effective for losing fat when combined with exercise.
It seems that way, yeah.
Mm.
Both 5-2 and time-restricted eating showed less fat loss compared to calorie restriction, and keto was the lowest ranked for this outcome.
Fascinating. So calorie restriction and exercise are consistently at the top for weight and fat loss. What about keeping muscle mass? A lot of people worry about losing muscle when they're trying to slim down.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where things get even more interesting because the rankings change again, and there's some differences between men and women.
Oh, really? That's cool.
So for men, good old calorie restriction with exercise still reigns supreme for keeping that lean body mass. Time-restricted eating with exercise came in second, and then the ketogenic diet with exercise.
So it seems pretty straightforward for men.
Yeah, kinda. The 5-2 intermittent fasting with exercise wasn't specifically ranked here for men, probably because not enough studies reported on it. But time-restricted eating had a slightly smaller effect on muscle mass compared to calorie restriction, and keto is similar to that.
Gotcha. What about women?
Okay, so for the ladies, hold on to your hats because time-restricted eating with exercise actually came out on top.
Whoa, really? That's a pretty big difference.
It is. So for women who are working out and trying to manage their diet, eating within a specific time window seems to be the best for holding on to muscle.
Wow, that's really important to know.
Yeah. And calorie restriction with exercise, it was a close second. Then 5-2 intermittent fasting with exercise. And again, keto is at the bottom of the list.
Okay, so big takeaway for our female listeners. Time-restricted eating might be worth looking into if you want to keep that muscle while you're exercising.
For sure. And it's just super interesting to see how the best strategy can vary between men and women when it comes to this.
Absolutely. The review also talked about the type of exercise, right? Did that matter?
Yeah, it did. So the general trends we've been talking about, they mostly held true no matter what kind of exercise people were doing. But there was this one finding about resistance training that's really interesting, especially for those of you who lift weights.
Oh, I'm all ears. I love lifting.
When resistance training was the primary exercise, combining it with intermittent fasting, either 5-2 or time-restricted eating seemed to be more effective for losing weight than combining it with calorie restriction or keto.
Really? So if you lift weights, intermittent fasting might be the way to go.
It seems that way, yeah. The study specifically mentioned the 5-2 approach in this context, but time-restricted eating likely shows similar benefits. It suggests that there might be something special about how resistance training and intermittent fasting work together.
That's really cool. Okay, we've talked a lot about intermittent fasting in the context of this study. Can we zoom out a bit and talk about what intermittent fasting actually is?
Yeah, let's do that. Intermittent fasting, it's kind of what it sounds like.
Yeah.
You basically go through periods of eating very little or nothing at all. The key is that these periods need to be long enough that your body might start making ketone bodies.
Ketone bodies, what are those?
They're like a backup fuel source that your body can tap into when it doesn't have enough glucose from carbs.
Oh, okay, so your body switches from burning sugar to burning fat.
Pretty much. And remember those common types of intermittent fasting we talked about. Time-restricted eating, alternate day fasting, and the 5-2 diet. Those all fit under this umbrella.
Right. But is the main benefit of intermittent fasting just about eating fewer calories overall?
That's a big debate in the research world. Some scientists think there are benefits beyond just calorie restriction. They talk about something called metabolic switching.
Metabolic switching.
Yeah, it's like flipping a switch in your body. You go from running on gasoline, which is glucose, to running on diesel, which is ketones.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks. And this switch, it might trigger some good stuff in your cells, like more DNA repair and better recycling of old cell parts.
Sounds promising, but do all researchers agree on this?
Not really. It's definitely an ongoing discussion. Some researchers, like Christopher Varady, who's a nutrition scientist, they're not totally convinced that intermittent fasting has benefits beyond just eating less. They think any positive effects are probably just from the calorie deficit.
Makes sense. So it's not a slam dunk.
Not yet. But then you have researchers like Mark Mattson, he's a neuroscientist, and he thinks our ancestors evolved to thrive on periods of not eating. He says our bodies are actually designed to work well in a fasted state.
So we evolved to fast. That's interesting.
It is. It adds another layer to the whole conversation.
For sure. Now, what about specific findings from recent research on intermittent fasting? Any interesting stuff there?
Yeah, actually, Courtney Peterson, a nutrition researcher, has found that time-restricted eating can lead to weight loss and even other health improvements that might go beyond just calorie reduction.
Like what?
Well, in one small study with men who had prediabetes, she saw improvements in insulin sensitivity, lower blood pressure, and less oxidative stress after they followed a time-restricted eating schedule.
Wow, so it could be really beneficial for metabolic health.
It could be. But it's worth noting that this was a small study, so more research is definitely needed. Then we have Nisa Maruther. She's a physician, and she offers a really practical perspective. She says if intermittent fasting helps you eat fewer calories overall, then it might be worth trying. It's about finding what works for you.
I like that approach. It's about finding what helps you stick to a healthy eating pattern in the long run. Okay, bringing it all back to the main analysis we started with. What are the key implications for our listeners who are trying to figure out the best diet and exercise plan for them?
All right, big picture takeaway is that if you're aiming to lose weight and reduce body fat, combining exercise with a focus on managing your calories seems to be the most effective strategy. Calorie restriction with exercise, it just consistently came out on top in this analysis.
That's pretty clear. But what about those interesting differences we talked about with lean body mass? What should people keep in mind there?
The fact that the best strategies for keeping muscle mass differed between men and women is definitely something to pay attention to. It suggests that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and you might need to adjust your diet based on your gender. And specifically for women, time-restricted eating with exercise seems really promising for preserving muscle.
So ladies, pay attention to that time-restricted eating.
Yes.
Now, time-restricted eating, that's just one type of intermittent fasting. We touched on a few other types. What's the deal with intermittent fasting as a whole?
Right, so intermittent fasting, it's not just about time restriction. It's about having those periods of not eating, which can have some really interesting effects on your metabolism.
We talked about those potential benefits earlier.
Exactly, like the whole metabolic switching thing and the possible cellular benefits. But remember, there's still debate about whether those benefits go beyond just eating fewer calories.
Right. Some experts think it's all about calorie restriction, while others believe there's more to it.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And another thing to keep in mind is that even though time-restricted eating wasn't always the top performer for weight and fat loss, when combined with exercise in that big analysis, it still has its perks.
Like what?
Well, a lot of people find it easier to follow a time-based eating schedule rather than meticulously tracking every calorie.
It's true. It can be less mentally taxing.
And some research even suggests that time-restricted eating could help you feel less hungry, which could be a huge win when you're trying to manage your weight.
So it could be a more sustainable approach for some people. Okay, what about the keto diet? Lots of people swear by it. What did the analysis say about keto and exercise?
Keto's a tricky one. It did pretty well for weight loss and BMI, coming in second place, but it was the least effective for fat loss when combined with exercise.
Huh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it seems like when you're exercising, calorie restriction might be the better option for fat loss compared to keto. Although, it's worth noting that there's some research suggesting keto might have benefits for cholesterol and triglycerides, but that wasn't the focus of this particular analysis.
Right, so it's all about what your specific goals are.
Exactly.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. But before we wrap up, let's talk about the limitations of all this research. What are some things to keep in mind when we're interpreting these findings?
Good point. No study is perfect. So the first thing is that a lot of the studies in the analysis had some limitations when it came to blinding, where the participants and the researchers don't know who's getting what treatment.
Right, it helps reduce bias.
Exactly. But with diet and exercise studies, it's really hard to blind people completely. You kind of know if you're on a keto diet or if you're doing resistance training.
That's true. It makes sense that that would be hard to hide.
Yeah. And that means we have to be a little cautious about the results. There were also some issues with how they put people into different groups and how they kept those assignments secret. So there's always a chance for some bias to sneak in.
Okay, so blinding was a bit of a challenge. Anything else?
Yeah, there was also quite a bit of inconsistency in the data for lean body mass, especially between studies.
Inconsistency.
Yeah, like the results varied a lot from study to study, which makes it harder to draw firm conclusions about that specific outcome. This inconsistency could be because of a bunch of things, like differences in how they designed the studies, who the participants were, how they measured lean body mass, or even publication bias, where studies with certain results are more likely to get published.
That makes sense. It's always important to look at the bigger picture and not just focus on one study.
Absolutely. And on top of that, a lot of the studies in the analysis mainly compared calorie restriction plus exercise with just calorie restriction alone. There wasn't as much information on some of the other combos, like exercise with 5-2 or keto. So we might need more research to be totally sure about those less studied combinations.
Makes sense. So more research is always a good thing.
Always.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to intermittent fasting research in general, there are even more limitations to consider. It's actually super hard to do perfect diet studies with humans because there are just so many variables.
Like what?
Well, everyone has their own unique eating habits, genes, and lifestyle, which can all affect the results. And even in a controlled study, it can be tricky to track people's calorie intake perfectly.
Yeah, I can see that. People aren't always accurate with food diaries and stuff.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of conflicting results. Different studies on intermittent fasting sometimes show different things about its benefits beyond weight loss.
Yeah.
And some of the studies that do show promising results, they might have had really small sample sizes, which makes it harder to generalize those findings to the whole population.
Right. A study with 20 people might not tell us much about what works for everyone.
Exactly. And last but not least, we just need more research on the long-term effects of intermittent fasting and how it affects specific groups of people.
Like who?
Like teenagers, older adults, people with type 2 diabetes, all sorts of different populations. One review even pointed out that there's not a ton of evidence on time-restricted eating, specifically for people with type 2 diabetes.
So there are still a lot of unanswered questions.
Definitely. But that's the exciting thing about science. There's always more to learn.
For sure. Okay, before we let our listeners go, let's circle back to those expert opinions. What were the main takeaways from the researchers who conducted this big analysis?
They were pretty clear about their conclusions. Based on all the evidence they looked at, they said that calorie restriction plus exercise seems to be the most effective strategy for losing weight and body fat overall.
So that's their top recommendation.
It is. And they also emphasized the gender differences we talked about with muscle mass, how calorie restriction plus exercise was best for men, and time-restricted eating plus exercise was most promising for women.
Right, right. So it's not just about what you eat, it's also about who you are.
Exactly.
Now, what about those other experts we talked about from the articles on intermittent fasting? There are some different opinions there, right?
Yeah, there were some disagreements. The main point of contention was whether intermittent fasting offers benefits that go beyond calorie reduction.
Right, like does it do something special for your metabolism or is it just about eating less overall?
Exactly. And some experts, like Mark Mattson, they're convinced that there are unique metabolic benefits to intermittent fasting, while others, like Krista Roddy, are more skeptical. And then you have Nisa Maruther, who takes a more pragmatic approach. She says if intermittent fasting helps you eat less, then go for it. It's about finding what works for you and your lifestyle.
That's great advice. It's not about dogma. It's about what helps you achieve your goals in a sustainable way.
Exactly.
We also looked at that other research, the big overview on intermittent fasting and health outcomes. What did that tell us?
That overview gave us a broader perspective on intermittent fasting in general, comparing it to consistently restricting calories or making no changes at all. They found some pretty solid evidence that intermittent fasting might help with things like waist circumference, fat mass, fasting insulin levels, and bad cholesterol. It also hinted at potential increases in good cholesterol and lean body mass.
So some positive signals there.
Yeah, but it's really important to remember that this overview wasn't specifically looking at how intermittent fasting works with exercise, which was the main focus of that first big analysis.
Right, so we can't directly compare those findings.
Exactly, but it's still useful information to have.
For sure. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground today, all sorts of different diets, exercise types, expert opinions. What's the bottom line for our listeners? What should they take away from this deep dive?
If you want the simplest answer, the strongest evidence we have suggests that combining exercise with a focus on managing your calorie intake is a really effective way to lose weight and body fat. Calorie restriction with exercise just consistently performed well across all those studies.
So that's a good starting point for anyone?
It is. And if you're curious about intermittent fasting, well, it shows some real promise, especially when paired with exercise. Time-restricted eating in particular stood out, especially for women trying to maintain their muscle mass. And remember that combo of resistance training and intermittent fasting. That had some interesting results for weight loss, too. But whether intermittent fasting has unique benefits beyond calorie restriction is still a bit of a mystery.
So there's more research to be done.
Always. But the takeaway for our listeners is to think about all this information as a starting point. The best approach for you depends on your personal goals, your preferences, and what you can realistically stick to in the long term.
What are some questions people can ask themselves to figure out the right path?
Great question. Think about things like, how would these different combinations fit into your daily life? Do you like tracking calories, or is a time-based eating window easier for you? If you're into weightlifting or want to maintain muscle mass, could combining that with intermittent fasting be a good option for weight management?
Those are some really good points to consider. And with that, we come to our final thought for this week.
Bring it on.
All this research is showing us more and more about the connection between when and how we eat and how it affects our workouts. But figuring out the perfect formula is still an ongoing journey, and that's exciting. So what small science-backed change could you try this week? Something to get you thinking, experimenting, and moving closer to your health goals.
That's something for everyone to ponder.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.